Hello folks, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to look at how to make PCBs at home in less than 30 minutes. So let's get started.
Alright folks, so let's make some PCBs quick and fast. So the key thing to make a PCB in less than 30 minutes is prep, and prep. Make sure that all the things that you need to make a PCB are already prepared and ready to go. For example, here I've set up my UV light and I have my laminator set up here. I have the exposer that I'm using today is nothing but just a regular nail dryer, and they use these in nail salons to dry nails after they paint it with UV ink. So these usually come with 4 9-watt tubes, but for PCB exposure I figured out that 4 tubes are way too much, so I removed 2 of those tubes and just used 2 tubes in there for a total of 18 watts of UV power. Restron film that I'm going to use, the UV sensitive film that I have ready there. I have my scrubbing pad, the scissors, tweezers and the tape, everything that I need there. I also have all my chemicals ready. I have the positive developer and the hydrogen peroxide, and I haven't yet taken out the hydrochloric acid. I'll do that just in time when I need to. Mind you that I have a big ventilator on top of this, and you definitely want to do this in a well ventilated area, and always try using glass or plastic containers for all your chemical stuff. So the first thing that I have here is I have my artwork printed on a transparency, and on the same transparency I have printed 2 copies of the artwork. I also have printed the pad masks, and the reason I have 2 copies is because a laser printer cannot print dark enough blacks to block the UV light from going through in 1.5 minutes for which we are going to expose it. You need to layer at least 2 transparencies together to block enough UV light and make the developing process easier. As you can see, I also have the layer aligning marks there. That makes it super easy to layer these 2 transparencies together. Now I go ahead and here I first cut the tracks. And then I cut the layer mask and then align them using the layer alignment marks that I've put on the transparencies. And even though I'll be using the layer mask later, I still go ahead and prepare it so that I don't have to come back and do this whole thing again. Now when I put these masks together, when I put these 2 layers together, I make sure I use enough tape to secure them in place so that no matter what I do, they don't move while I'm exposing. And in this case, more is better. Once I have the transparencies aligned, I'll cut the PCB to size to fit the transparency, and I use aircraft shears to cut the PCB, and this makes it really simple or effortless to actually cut a PCB. I tried a whole lot of things. I used aircraft shears is so far the best tool that I've found to cut PCBs into size. So here I'm preparing the PCB to put on the Restron photosensitive film, and first I give it a nice scrub and take away any blemishes that I have on the copper surface or just any oils. Once that is done, I give it a nice rub with isopropyl alcohol. This is 99% pure alcohol, and I let it sit there for some time, and that will dissolve any impurities that are on the surface. And once that is done, I just wipe it off with a paper towel. Now once I have the PCB cleaned, I measure the Restron film and cut it to size. And a little extra is fine, because all it will do is it will just be on the sides of the PCB, and that's no harm. One thing you have to be sure is that when you're working with the Restron film, make sure that you are in an area which is lit by an incandescent bulb and not by your fluorescent bulbs, because you don't want any UV exposure at this point to the Rust-On film. Now, the way the Rust-On film is actually packaged is it has two layers of adhesives, one on the top and one at the bottom, and before applying it to the PCB you have to take off one layer of the backing foil. And the easiest way to do this is to use a tweezer to squeeze one corner of it and then gently peel off the layer. This is by far the easiest way that I have figured out to do this. Now, once you have the layer off, make sure you apply the Rust-On film to the PCB and start gently by pressing in the center of the PCB and then slightly pressing outwards. You don't need to do a thorough job because the laminator is going to do a much better job in applying this film to the PCB. Once you just get the Rust-On film on the PCB, put the PCB in a folded sheet of paper, and you don't want to put the PCB as is through the laminator. That is because most of the time what would happen is the Rust-On film will get stuck to the laminator on the inside and it will be a big mess. So you don't want to just put the PCB as is through the laminator. So I always use a scrap paper to carry the PCB through the laminator. And this helps because that means that what I can do is I can also have really tiny PCBs through the laminator at times and have the paper carry it. Now all you have to do is you have to do this pass a few times. I would say about 3 to 4 times is more than enough. That will make sure that the film is stuck well to the PCB. And what that would also do is that will also make the film stick to the paper as well, but that's fine, you can just tear it off. And there you have it. You have the Rust-On film attached to the PCB with a top layer still on the Rust-On film, which is the protective layer, and you don't want to take it off now. Now here I have my transparencies attached to a sheet of glass, and these are just regular, rather a 4x6 photo frame glass that I had purchased from IKEA for about $1 or so. And the first thing you need is you need to make sure that your glass that you are exposing it on is really clean. Just give it a nice wipe. Once you have the glass clean, just attach the transparency and make sure that the right side is up. And the way you decide that is when you look through the glass, you have to make sure that all the text that you have on the PCB looks correct and it is legible. Use some tape to attach the transparency to the glass sheet. Once the transparency is attached to the sheet, align the PCB to the sheet. Now here I am taking a bit longer because the PCB size was just right for the transparency, so I had to be really precise in positioning it so that I didn't have any traces that were outside the PCB. And once I get that, I just attach it with a few more pieces of tape. I probably would have done this much faster, but I just wanted to make sure that I'm doing it right for the first time so that I don't have to do this over and over again. Now once this is done, I get my UV exposer and I place it on top of the glass and I turn it on for 1.5 minutes exactly. And that's all you would need for it to expose the tracks onto the PCB. Now the 1.5 minute you have to be a bit careful is if your artwork is not really dense or dark, what would end up happening is a lot more of the photoresist film will get exposed and it will be really difficult to get it off. So that you have to make sure that if your printer is not printing dark enough, you may have to go for 2 or maybe 3 layers of transparencies, so that I've come up with these numbers from what has worked for me, so your mileage may vary. Now here I'm preparing the developer solution, and what I've done is, since I've done this so many times, I have these fixed set of cups that I know what the exact measurement is going to be. So usually you would take a 1:10 ratio of the developer to water, and the way I have measured this is 1 tablespoon of the developer and 2 small cups of water gives me exactly 1:10 concentration. And to get the process faster, I recommend you have such pre-measured cups, so that you don't have to measure 10 tablespoons of water every time you prepare this solution. So that's one, and that's the second one that gives me a perfect 1:10 ratio of the developer, which I'll be using to take the undeveloped film off the PCB. Here again, now I have switched to incandescent bulbs since I'm exposing the undeveloped PCB to the developer. Now I take off the transparencies of the PCB and drop the board in the developer for about 1 minute. I let it sit there for about a minute, and then after about a minute is done, I use a brush, a soft bristle brush, and brush off the unexposed resist from the board. This is really not necessary, but if you do this, you'll be able to, if you do this, you will be able to expose much thinner traces, and with this method I was easily able to do 10 thal traces on PCBs. So be gentle with the brush, because you really don't want to scrub it hard and take off the actual resist of the PCB as well. So as you can see, I'm just brushing over all the traces and getting everything cleaned. The other thing to note is, make sure you never keep the board for more than a minute and a half in the developer, because that would make the rest of the film really weak and it might peel off during etching. One thing you will want to remember is, whenever you are building a PCB, you try to correct the errors as early as possible in the stage, and they become much easier to fix earlier than later. So for example, if I see a wrong trace in here, and if I let it sit there and I let it etch, it will be much difficult for me to fix it later than going in and using either a marker or a knife to correct the trace right here at this point, than going ahead and etching. Now at this point, what I can also do is, if I think that the PCB is completely wrong, I can just redevelop the whole PCB and etch. I can redevelop the PCB, and I can take the film completely off this PCB, and it will be again a brand new PCB which I can use, put a new layer of film on, and redo the whole thing. So you really want to check if everything you are doing is right at this stage itself. Now I've noticed a few of the places where the film hasn't come off in the 1.5 minutes. So what I'm doing here is, I'm doing a spot developing, where I just take some developer on the brush and then just apply a little on and around the places where it has not developed well. And when I do that, I can do spot developing of the places where the film hasn't come off. Even after doing this, sometimes I would need to use an X-Acto knife and go and clean up a few traces to make sure that all the film is taken off the traces. Now once I'm sure that I got almost everything off, I just dab it dry on a paper towel, check it again, and just make sure that I have all my traces still on the board. Now at this point, if I overexpose the board, I might have lost a few traces. As you can see in the longer trace down at the bottom, which is slightly thinner, I might have lost that trace right there. Now since I noticed that, what I can do is I can just go ahead, take a Sharpie and put a dot on top of it, or I can redraw the whole trace with a Sharpie and I can save that trace etching away. Now apart from that one trace, there were a couple of places where I would need to take off the film, or it might not have come off properly. And I think most of these were the thermal reliefs around the ground planes. So I just clean them out with a sharp knife and then use a Sharpie to fix some of the traces that might have overdeveloped. Alright folks, so unfortunately I didn't realize this, but my card was full while I was etching the board. But the process is, once I get the PCB developed, I put 1 part muriatic acid and 1 part hydrogen peroxide into a bowl. Then I heat this up in the microwave for about 30 to 40 seconds. The temperature rises up to 140 degrees and you want to get it nice and warm. Apart from that, when you do that, you also need a bowl of water in a plastic pan and heat that up in the microwave for about a minute and a half as well, till it gets really warm. Now what you want to do is you want to take the acid mixture in the pot and keep this whole pot inside this bigger water bath, so that the water will keep the acid container warm. You want to make sure that the temperature in the acid is about 140 degrees, and the reason for that is you want the etching reaction to be fast, so that it will just affect the exposed copper quickly without actually damaging any traces under the non-exposed parts. This is again very critical if you are going for really thin traces, something around 10 or less than 10 thals. Once I do that, I get this etched PCB, and this will take only about a minute or so, not more than that. And the same thing, you want to do a spot etching if you feel that some of the places on the PCB are not etched properly and the rest of the thing is almost done. You don't want to leave the PCB in the acid. You want to take it out and do a spot etching using a brush and apply the chemical to only those places which are not etched. And once that is done, you will get your etched board. And on this board you can see there are 2 places where I have actually put the Sharpie marks. Now once you have etched, make sure you have saved your developer solution and just drop the board in there and let it sit in there for a minute or 2. And what that would do is that would take off all the wrist-on layer or the photosensitive layer that we have put on, and it will clean the board up. The layer would completely come off and you will have your etched board ready. Just wash it in water again, dry it, and there you have it, a beautiful PCB ready. For most of the people at this point, you can go ahead and start drilling in the holes and you're done with the PCB. But I'm not just satisfied with the finish that I get with this board. So stick with me, and what we'll do is we'll apply a silk screen mask on top of this.